Time is ticking. Whether it is policymakers in the public sector or decision makers in the private sector, urgent action has never been more critical. The latest report by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a code red for humanity. Sadly, the repeatedly ignored warnings by scientists over the past decades have now become reality. As a global real estate company headquartered in Singapore, CDL is glad to have started our sustainability journey over 2 decades ago. Since 1995, we have embodied our ethos of conserving as we construct, and we believe that businesses can play a key role to building a sustainable future. Green buildings have been a top priority in the way we design, build, and manage our properties. Over the years, our sustainability strategy aims to achieve 3 deliverables: decarbonization, digitalization and innovation, as well as the disclosure of ESG performance. This is in line with our mission to provide green, safe, and healthy spaces for building users. This long-standing commitment has paved the way for the transformation of CDL's operations towards a low-carbon future. In February this year, CDL became the first real estate developer in Singapore and the first real estate conglomerate in Southeast Asia to sign on to this World Green Building Council's Net Zero Carbon Buildings commitment. Going forward, CDL will further accelerate our climate action to ensure that our business is not only doing good for all stakeholders and the environment today, but also contributing to a more resilient world where generations to come will enjoy, prosper, and live with good health.
The development of climate change solutions is an ongoing and collective effort across multiple levels, and there are many opportunities for Singapore to be engaged actively. At the institution level, Republic Polytechnic's efforts are aligned with the national focus on sustainable development to mitigate all the risks and threats brought about by climate change. Our campus have been recertified as a Green Mark Platinum Award in 2021, and there are various efforts to reduce energy consumption in our campus through the retrofitting of our chiller plant, conversion of AC fans to electronically commuted fans, the installation of solar panels in 9 building rooftops, as well as the changing of lighting type to LED. In supporting the mass rollout of electric vehicles in Singapore, we have also worked closely with various industry partners to develop training programs to support the manpower and skills requirements, as well as the charging infrastructure. Over at RP, we roll out on-campus initiatives to encourage all our staff and students to play their part through recycling of used items and reduction in energy and water consumption. These efforts are championed by our students from the Conservation Interest Group to positively influence our students and staff. Climate change is affecting everybody because it is not just a national issue but a global challenge. Everyone has a role to play, and we can all start by adopting a positive mindset that we can do our part, regardless of how big or small the effort is.
Welcome to this 6th virtual forum session at the Singapore Perspectives Conference 2022. My name is Christopher Gee, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies. Before we start, may I quickly remind everyone of the following administrative matters. Please submit your questions for the panelists via the question submission section on this forum page. You can do this at any time during the session. The session is open to media coverage. We invite all at our conference to contribute to our discussions in a respectful and safe manner, focused on the issues at hand. IPS reserves the right to ensure that this is always the case in the chat and Q&A functions on our conference site. Now on to the matters at hand for this forum session. We have heard from the sessions earlier today about how the city, this global city-state called Singapore, can be a connected and connecting space, a vibrant and dynamic economic space. And later today, we will have another session on what makes a fully digitally capable city. Last week, inclusivity, cosmopolitanism, and resilience were all discussed in sessions involving a range of distinguished speakers. Now we turn our attention to the city as a green space. This hyper-urban, densely populated 740 square kilometers of space that has been known as a garden city ever since the concept was first introduced by the then Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, in May 1967, with the idea that Singapore should be a city with abundant greenery and a clean environment for the benefit of citizens. And he also announced an ambitious timeline of just 3 years to achieve that goal. Now, more than 50 years on, there's still remarkably quite a lot of green physical space, and indeed, the planting of trees is one part of the Singapore Green Plan 2030 announced just under a year ago. But the environmental challenges that confront citizens today are very different. They go well beyond just planting and growing trees. And the question that can perhaps be implied in the title to this session is, can this city, this global city, act as a green space, not just in its territorial limits, not simply an oasis protected from a scary world outside, but something more, extending beyond the city limits to having a positive multiplier effect on its ASEAN hinterland and beyond? This is quite a challenging goal to consider this question in the 90 minutes that we have for this session. But I'm pleased to say that we have two eminent urban environmental scientists here with us to help talk through the matter. May I then introduce our two speakers, Dr. Olivia Jensen and Dr. Harvey Neo. Olivia is lead scientist working on environment and climate issues at the Lloyd's Register Foundation Institute for the Public Understanding of Risk at NUS. She specializes in water and environmental policy in urban Asia, looking at the landscape of environmental risks and designing and evaluating policy interventions to strengthen the resilience of urban communities. She was previously a senior research fellow at the Institute of Water Policy, here within the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Harvey is senior fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities, Singapore University of Technology and Design, SUTD, and his research focuses on critical urban studies, citizen urban science and policy making, as well as nature-society interactions. At the center, he leads the Cities Cluster Research on the future of Asian cities, considering how a citizen-centric urban science can be practiced and sustained in tandem with big data, and in so doing, how it can influence urban policies positively. Olivia and Harvey will each make some points for about 15 minutes each before we move on to what I hope will be an open and purposeful discussion with all of you on this concept of city as a green space. Olivia, would you like to start us off, please?
Thank you very much, Christopher. And much as I'm sorry not to have a chance to be in the room together with you and Harvey and with our audience, I'm looking out on one of Singapore's many lovely green spaces right now, so I shan't complain too much. Let me start with a few thoughts about where the city fits in terms of discussions about sustainability and also resilience in that more focused sense of being resilient to climate shocks and environmental shocks. And how can the city withstand these and bounce back? But on the one hand, cities are clearly part of the solution. Their size and their density means that they generate economies of scale in the classical sense, that achieving these services, delivering these services is cheaper per capita when people are and assets are densely packed. And of course, the abundance of skills within a city and thriving innovation systems is also likely to lead to the generation of more solutions, more ideas. And that concentration of people and assets also justifies investing in resilience. Thinking about coastal defense provides us with one example. On the other hand, of course, that concentration of population and of productive assets amplifies the risks from pollution, from climate change, from unsustainable resource use, from biodiversity loss. And cities inevitably draw on the resources of their hinterlands. They put pressure on their regional environment. They may be in competition, sometimes direct competition, for scarce resources like land and water, the way that land is used, whether to, say, produce food or to provide a space for extra residential development. And cities and their hinterlands have to find ways to share these resources. Cities also depend on their hinterlands for disposal of waste. In the water sector, that often means the regions and localities which are downstream on the river. In Singapore's case, that means the coast and the ocean. So what impact does the city have on its environment, beyond its borders and even beyond the land itself? And very often, the hinterland of a city is in a different administrative jurisdiction. Often that's a different province or a different state, so a different subnational government. In Singapore's case, of course, it means an international border. So Singapore has the additional challenge then of conceiving and interacting with its neighbors, neighboring states, in order to achieve sustainability goals. I mean, this is going to involve coordination, hopefully cooperation with its neighbors. In terms of cities as the solution then, I mean, there are many, many excellent examples from Singapore and from other leading cities at the forefront of sustainability and climate action in terms of what can be achieved. And the greatest achievements are related, I think, to sound governance and to joined-up policy making. Think of a few examples, drawing a lot on Singapore's efforts and experience. I mean, one possibility is to link up the energy system with public housing. In Singapore, that takes the form of installing solar panels on HDB roofs and of designing new housing developments around sustainability goals. There's potential to join up solid waste management with wastewater management and to couple that together with energy generation. And that's exactly what's being conceived and built at the Tuas Nexus plant at the moment. That's going to be entirely energy self-sufficient. There's also potential to coordinate between transport policy and green space management. So we've got, on the one hand, on the transport side, efforts to limit vehicle numbers, to improve access to public transport, and to stimulate zero carbon mobility, cycling, walking, and to link that up with efforts around parks, park connectors, and greenways, so that people can use those not just for recreation, but as a way of getting about the city to their places of work. So taking action across sectors is always challenging from a policy design and an implementation point of view. But it's much more feasible and more likely to happen at the level of the city, where in many cases, policymakers from different sectors can meet each other physically and can see each other's work in the same space. All these initiatives can offer very important co-benefits as well, as we well know, in terms of livability, improved air quality, physical fitness, if we go back to the walking and cycling example. And of course, reducing carbon emissions is not the only policy goal, and nor should it be. And so sometimes we can think of it the other way around. Are policies that are actually driving and improving public health, quality of life, or economic prosperity, can those be the driver? And can they then generate co-benefits for the environment? Into this kind of inter-sector policy planning and implementation is one of Singapore's outstanding strengths. As you said in the introduction, my specialization has been a lot on the water sector. And Singapore is an excellent example, I think, for cities and for countries on how to link up the different aspects of water policy. And Singapore is able to apply this same kind of connected policymaking approach to other policy areas related to sustainability. I wanted to mention also that this relationship between the city and its hinterland is really important when it comes to tracking performance. So if we think about tracking performance and sustainability across time, but also comparing across cities, who should Singapore be benchmarking itself against and how? For Singapore, of course, this is a critical issue because the country relies so much on imports of raw materials, of processed goods, as well as for food, and still today for water, perhaps in the future also for green electricity. So in order to set meaningful indicators and to use those indicators to identify appropriate policies, we need to define the boundary of the system carefully. If we only track indicators that follow the actions and the changes within the city itself, within the island state, then that could possibly lead to less attention being paid to these very important issues of interconnectivity with neighbors. So I'd say, in fact, albeit at the risk of information overload, that we probably need lots of indicators. And we need indicators at these different levels. So within the city and within the region as well. For Singapore, there's also an extra issue that it's a top maritime and an aviation hub. And those sectors generate are important sources of emissions globally as well. Now, it wouldn't be appropriate to allocate those emissions to Singapore, but nevertheless, Singapore needs to engage and is engaging in international fora on how to reduce emissions in these important transport sectors. So I guess at the moment, in amongst all the excellent plans and initiatives here, it can actually be difficult to get a handle on the relative importance or contribution of these different policies and these different efforts in meeting Singapore's key carbon emissions goal. I mean, that information isn't readily available in the plans and in the policy documents and in the discussions. And my feeling is that more information about the relative contribution of these different policies would be very helpful for interested parties to focus their efforts in contributing to finding solutions and to support this kind of intersectoral connectivity. I think members of the public are aware of this too. I mean, in the discussions that we've held with communities, within focus groups and interviews, people often signal that they want to see that policies are consistent and fair. A couple of examples of that might be in relation to the way that electric vehicles are taxed and the kinds of incentives around EV, or in the relative balance between protecting forested areas, existing ones, and planting new trees. So people want to see consistency across policies, and they're aware of the sort of myriad of efforts and want to see how those fit together. I think it's clear, both from the policymakers' point of view and from the point of view of stakeholders and the public in general, that what's needed on carbon emissions is a whole of nation effort. And so what is it that citizens need to do? I mean, it would be easier and in a sense fairer if we all had an individual carbon budget, and in our Apple Watch, we could have an emissions tracker that would tell you just how you're doing, like your health tracker does. You'd then have a very clear idea of what personally you need to do in terms of taking actions. But for now, that doesn't exist. And so it's quite difficult for people to know how to prioritize. I mean, there are carbon footprint apps, but including ones that are tailored specifically to Singapore. But either they give a very generic response, or you have to put in such a level of detail that you might spend days on this, trying to work out how much beef you eat, where it comes from, what form of transport is used to bring it to Singapore. And there's another level too, which is that what is it that people can actually exercise choice over? So if you have to travel by plane for work, Should you be counting that into your personal carbon budget or not? And I think this uncertainty about how to prioritize, it's really come across in the focus groups and the interviews that we've done. And people will say to us, look, I really want to do my bit. Just tell me what I need to do. And it remains a difficult question to answer. What we can do is separate out, characterize 3 different types of environmental actions. Some of those actions are what we might call private sphere actions. It's things like conservation, your consumption choices. And those are the ones that are most familiar to people. They could be simple things like turning the temperature up on your aircon, renting clothes rather than buying them, or more deeper lifestyle choices like becoming a vegetarian. But that's not the end of environmental action. I mean, a second set of actions is around the community level or the community sphere. That means talking to friends and family about climate change, perhaps giving to a charity or being part of a local community group which engage in coastal cleanup. And then there's the third sphere, and that's the public sphere. That's about engaging in public policies and supporting policies which are going to make a difference in terms of carbon emissions and environmental performance. That means things like writing to your MP, signing a petition, or blogging in your support for climate actions. Generally, people are focused on the first set, but really it could be the community and the public actions that make most of the difference. Say that when it comes to garnering support for climate-friendly policies, Singapore is in a really strong position. People have a very high level of general trust in government. They are very aware of climate change and they're concerned about it. In all the discussions that we've had, we haven't found any evidence of climate denialism, people who say it's not happening or people are not responsible for it. People don't necessarily see the risk to themselves as individuals, though. And in this, they're entirely consistent with what experts in Singapore say as well. So they see a global risk, but they don't see a personal risk. I think what's going on there is that Singapore has an excellent track record of investing in infrastructure to ensure that the country runs smoothly. And people are expecting that the government will also achieve this when it comes to climate change. It's what we might call a caretaker effect, that a child holding the hand of its parent doesn't bother to look left and right when crossing the road. They trust that somebody else is going to look after them. I'm not sure that's critical, because at the same time as people don't feel a personal fear, we do sense that people are ready to make commitments and to make changes in order to support Singapore's climate and environment goals. Perhaps the area in which anxiety and uncertainty creep in, and this might lead to opposition to policies, is around what the impacts of some of the transition regulations and technological developments might be for individuals. And perhaps the communications gap and the communications focus going forward will be to try to convey to people what the kinds of impacts, what policies are in the pipeline and what kinds of impacts they might have on people. And my feeling there is that the more transparency and the further in advance people can have information about these new policies, the more researchers, civil society organizations, the media can engage with these policy proposals, analyze them, and then try to help people work out what the impacts for them as individuals would be. My feeling is that given that many of the solutions to reducing emissions aren't known yet, haven't even been invented yet, the more people we have engaged in that search, the better. And the transparency around the policy future will help to accelerate that process. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Olivia, for that presentation. I'm intrigued by what you talked about cities being concentrators of innovation and solutioning. but also of risk. And also the point you made about Singapore not having the same administrative control over its hinterland. So how do we go about exerting leadership, both in a forward way, but also in an enabling leadership role, in what I think you termed off as a connecting policymaking role? We will come back to that after Harvey's remarks. Harvey, can we hand over the mic to you for your opening remarks?
Yes. Thank you, Christopher, and thank you, Olivia. So I'm going to just extend a little bit on what Olivia has said, and my brief discussion will center around value of nature and the nature of value. So I'll start with the nature of value first. How does one give value or credit to any given entity? If we take countries, for instance, how does one value countries comparatively or in each country's own terms? And there are many ways to measure performance or valuation of country. For instance, a country might be valued for its natural resource stock, in which case Singapore will be valued very lowly. In other words, perform very, very poorly as compared to the rest of the world. But if a country is valued for the economic growth it has achieved, then Singapore will be valued very highly. Amongst the post-colonial countries, I guess Singapore will be valued the highest in this regard. So now I kind of segue into economic development. Economic development is precisely the definitive ethos of Singapore, the imperative which arguably drives all other imperatives. If I put it differently, we can even say that policies and decisions are invariably considered in relation to how this might affect economic development. And we are talking about policies and decisions across sector. So it is not just with regards to green issues or the environment, which is the topic of our discussion today. So if we look at decisions surrounding green space specifically now and the natural environment, we can say that our highly successful imaging of Singapore as the garden city, which Christopher alluded to earlier, since our independence years, is driven perhaps less by the aesthetics of greenery in and of itself, and it is by how it can contribute to the overall attractiveness of Singapore as a site of foreign investment. So in other words, yes, there is the aesthetics aspect, but it may not, and it probably isn't the key driving force of having such a ambitious vision, of transforming a Singapore that is pretty much, well, it's green, but not as green as now, so the ambitious plan to turn it into a city of garden of city. So that is ambitious, and that drives not solely on the back of aesthetics of greenery. So this was an early example from the 1960s. In fact, this driving imperative of economic development has persisted to this day, and indeed normalized into the logic of Singaporeans. So in other words, across common conversations and across topics, there is always this, well, I wouldn't even call it afterthought. It is inserted right into this discussion. What is this going to mean for, economy or growth, etc., etc. I'm not saying that this is a wrong kind of thinking. Actually, on the contrary, I do believe that it is nothing really objectionable about placing economic development at the forefront of multiple goals each country has to attain simultaneously. So there's nothing wrong, really. The problem with having this kind of thinking when it comes to green spaces or green issue is that it is not always quite straightforward to determine if any decision or any action that we make will push economic development or, ironically, actually ends up pushing away economic development. This is especially true when we attempt to think not of the immediate, but of the long run. As it were, a lot of actions that we do that have environmental impacts do not appear quite immediately. Right? Sometimes it takes decades. Sometimes it's not within our lifetime that we see it. So there is a specific problematic of green space, green policies when it is injected into this overall logic of, okay, let's think about economic development, what is this going to mean for us? Again, I must say that, again, there's nothing wrong with having economic development as a driving imperative, which I think works for Singapore. So, and there's nothing really without economy, I think. So that aside, I think what I want to add on is also that it's not to say that green policies are often or always not clearly aiding economic development, especially if such policies are successfully implemented and they indeed reach intended objectives. So, to give a very broad example, green technology would be something like this. So if we were to go have a very comprehensive strategy or nationwide strategy to push for green technology, then it is true that such a so-called green policy can drive economic development. Again, caveat is that it has to be successful. Right, so extending on this line of thinking, the title of this session today, The City as Green Space, I feel it carries an additional significance of seeing the green space of cities as sites of intervention to drive the economy. In other words, the city provides us with a think tank, urban laboratory, in which we can locate problems and, more importantly, suggest solutions to such problems. And Singapore, for better or for worse, is a perfect microcosm of such a site of city, a site of urban intervention when it comes to green issues. So, in other words, a green technology then would be an example of a commoditization of nature. So it is not unlike how we used to commoditize natural resources like minerals and forests. So this is all I'm going to say about the nature of value. Let's talk a little bit about the value of nature. So in other words, how does one value nature economically or extra-economically? I'm not going to say a lot about this, but just to preface it by saying that it is unfortunately a question which is wrapped in often irreducible differences in one's ethics and outlook. And of course, one's ethics and outlooks are in turn tightly linked to one's socio-economic class. So in other words, the question of how is nature valued, how does one value nature, it really depends on who you're asking. So that provides an additional complicating point. So it's not inconceivable and it's not surprising at all that valuing nature for its own terms, say the aesthetics of it, which I mentioned earlier, valuing nature for its own term loses often to the vulgar and highly simplified, development versus conservation debate. So this, of course, is very unfortunate. It is unfortunate because if a debate is often started through, if one side often loses consistently for the lack of a common language with the other side, and not only that, the losing side are forced to converse in the discourse of its opponents. I think that's not a very ideal situation because we then end up losing what should have been saved. So I will leave it at that now. Maybe in the discussion we can think about more examples to illustrate this point. So not ideal situation when one side loses consistently for the lack of a common language. And the language that they have to adopt is the opponent's language. So the nature of value versus value of nature language is different. But more importantly, actually, if we do not value nature for its own terms, it also means that environmental actions that are not immediately apparent to reap economic benefits for oneself or for one's country often fail, often falter, because one cannot see why we are doing such a thing. There's no benefits, economic benefits to us. And as Olivia alluded to earlier, the kind of distant benefits that can be accrued through my actions cannot see it, right? And if I can see it, I have only very, very little benefits that it will come back to me. So it is that kind of thinking that is almost part and parcel of the nature of value thinking that I've illustrated earlier. So it is completely devoid of this valuing nature for its own terms logics. So if I want to take an example, recycling behavior is a good example. And Singapore, I would say, has a very challenging track record and performance in this regard. Partly, I guess, because of this whole idea of not being able to value nature for its own terms. So whatever we do, we have to see it in some concrete pragmatic terms. And I think it's not always easy to see that. Right? I'm not saying that recycling doesn't have that kind of payback or benefits to us. It does, actually. It's just not quite easy to see. So I think my little discussion here, I think I still have 1 or 2 minutes, but that's fine. So I'll hand it over to Christopher.
Thank you, Harvey. I'm really glad that you waded into the concepts of valuation and measurement of the environment and nature. Given the huge challenge that outcomes in this space play out over a longer time frame, and certainly beyond the immediate field of vision of policymakers and citizens with apparent pressing goals, something like the pandemic, such as economic development, as you mentioned. And maybe before we open out the discussion to the audience, I see some questions already coming in. Maybe we can focus on 2 areas where I think we'd like to. I'd like to flesh out the discussion a little bit more, and let's stay with the topic of measurement. Right? If we don't measure it, we don't know what we know and we don't know. Right? So where do you see this whole measurement thing, this standard setting thing? How does that play out in the next few years? Because I sense that the time is now. There is a gap, and maybe something needs to be done collectively. And maybe I can put it to you to discuss or talk about what you think Singapore's role in this process. So maybe Olivia, would you like to kick off and your thoughts on that question?
Sure. I think it's really helpful when coming up with an indicator set to have a very clear idea about what the overarching policy objective is. In the case of water, we've looked at that in terms of water security, and then try to get a really multidimensional perspective on what water security means, including both its environmental aspects, its service quality aspects, as well as the risks associated with water from flooding. So I'm wondering whether that same kind of approach isn't going to be useful across the board in terms of coming up with an indicator set for other environmental issues. It's definitely more difficult when you have a very big and pretty much impossible to define concept like sustainability. And I think that's one of the big challenges, and a lot of academic energy is devoted to trying to define it. I'm not sure how useful that is for policymakers and other decision makers. It's easier also when we come to, if we focus in on the mitigation part of climate change. And here we've got this universal, this global indicator, which is carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. And all countries in the world are setting their goals in terms of that single indicator. So that's very useful. The challenge is how then to break that indicator down, or to break that goal down into sort of sector-specific goals, which can then be more easily translated into policy. But having that sort of single global indicator is a very useful one, and is a very important part of the international effort. And so Singapore has also very clearly set its goal for 2030 in terms of the volume of greenhouse gas emissions. also just come back for a minute to this issue of scale and how you set the system boundary. I think it's really important to deal with that and to deal with it transparently, because otherwise whether it's a government or a public agency or a firm or a group of firms who are developing these indicators, almost instantly sort of triggers skepticism and distrust if people feel that the indicators have been selected on the basis of what's easiest for that agency or firm to achieve. And people are very sensitive to greenwashing, and there are lots of bloggers and others out there who are going to help them to be sensitive to it as well. So being able to justify the selection of indicators that are used, again, in a transparent way, even ideally in involving stakeholders from outside your specific organization, is a very helpful way, I think, to build trust, and importantly, to be trustworthy, to deserve that people pay attention to these indicators. If you want, and we certainly do, want everybody to engage in trying to meet these objectives.
Thanks. Harvey, any thoughts on this matter?
Yes. So this, it's always necessary to have a framework to compare performance, regardless what kind of performance we are talking about. I feel that one of the challenges is really how fine-grained do you want this framework to be? If you make it too detailed, like too many sub-indicators to track, multifarious kinds of aspects to look at, I think that has two negative impacts. First, will discourage people from actually trying to get on this framework of analysis. And second is it becomes something that is completely insensitive to the local context because it becomes so fine-grained, and the weighting process will be unclear as well. And invariably, such framework will be pushed by countries or consultancy firms which has enough power or enough prestige to launch such a framework, a global framework, for instance. So that is a consideration, I feel. And as opposed to, well, if you go the other way and you make it so broad and so general when everyone is going to be on board, it really doesn't measure anything in any comparative sense at the end of the day, nor does it measure anything in and of itself. I think that would be a danger too. So this balance, I think, is very hard to find. And for instance, from my perspective, I think Singapore loses out on most of the environmental performance indicators out there for reasons beyond our control. I think that would be something that needs to be done. I feel maybe we should come out with our own performance indicators. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, actually, we can stay with that, Harvey, with that thought. It's a topic that I really I'm quite passionate about. And it's this idea of who leads in this space, right? You talked about the difficulty of finding the right level, right, finding the right context. But perhaps what we could do is find leaders, right? Different, whether it's companies or community leaders or different countries focusing on specific areas where they have I guess quite a lot of concentration, right, in terms of their resources, natural resources. Then strikes back to what Olivia was talking about. We then move away from this caretaker idea or mindset, and then take ownership of the matter, right? Each of us then has agency. We lead in that space. What are your thoughts on that?
I think, yeah, like a coalition that you speak of would have more legitimacy. I feel, all things being equal. So that perhaps should be the way forward. But whether we could truly gather such a coalition, I'm not so sure how is it done or whether it's done before. Especially in the context of Singapore, you have to include the voices of the people, of the business. I'm not sure how that actually plays out. And at the end of the day, you are still left with a product that may not be taken up by anyone else but yourself, in which case it defeats the purpose too. So I think it is the right way, but I think it's still a challenge ultimately. It's a solution that I can see is viable, but I'm not sure the success.
Olivia, any thoughts from the water perspective? I think you highlighted some potential examples there where there might be some kind of gathering of this coalition that Harvey was talking about.
I think what makes it really challenging in the sustainability area, and what makes it perhaps a little easier in reference to water, is that it's not really clear what our policy objective is in sustainability generally. And different organizations, public and private and civil society, actually have different goals in mind. And maybe that's why we find it so difficult to agree on what the indicators are. So I want to come back to Harvey's emphasis in his initial remarks on values and the importance of having that discussion about values. I think it could be a very fruitful one, albeit challenging, as you said, Harvey. And there are examples of, let's say, in river management or integrated water resource management in Australia comes to mind as a leading example of bringing together stakeholders from multiple sectors in a forum and having a very explicit discussion about values up front before you begin to discuss the costs and benefits of different policies. And I wonder whether a discussion of that kind can't be successful also with regard to sustainability more generally. My feeling is that when people do say in surveys that they're willing to give up a bit of economic growth for a better environment, in Singapore as in other Asian countries, my feeling is that that's not just a social acceptability bias. They're not just saying that to please the interviewer, but because people actually at all economic levels do value the environment. And on that basis, it would both be so then useful and interesting for businesses and for governments to engage to understand what the right balance should be between economic development objectives and environmental objectives. And perhaps that discussion about values would actually reveal more common ground than we might at first think.
Cool. Thanks, Olivia. And maybe I'll then go to some of the audience questions now, if I may, and pick up some of the questions around the environmental impact that we're having in terms of things like land reclamation. We have 3 questions, anonymous questions, about rising sea levels and perhaps Singapore's reaction to that, and the impact that might have on our neighbors as well. For example, getting sand from our neighbors, right, and the impact that might have on those countries. Any thoughts on that matter? Maybe Olivia first, and then Harvey.
Sure, with pleasure. So I think with regard to rising sea levels, we've done quite a bit of work discussing the nature of the perceived risk with members of the public, as well as with experts, different sorts of experts. So engineers, hydrologists, as well as activists who are engaged in this particular issue area. When it comes to the perceptions of the public with regard to sea level rise, in the short term, people seem fairly confident. This caretaker effect seems to predominate. The government's doing something, it's got a coastal adaptation study, it's beginning to invest in coastal defenses in the places that have been identified as more at risk. In the long term, there's a very contrary view, which is that Singapore is at risk of submersion. So we had many times in our interviews and our discussions, Singapore is going to be under the waves. I'm worried that Singapore is like Venice and it's going to, it's just not going to be there anymore. And I think that characterization of climate change in these dramatic terms, which people see a lot in the media, can contribute to this. from the point of view of experts, the risk is one of inundation. It's a flood risk. And you need to understand how then sea level rise intersects with weather phenomena, with storm events, with interseasonal and interannual weather phenomena that are going to lead to what's called a surge, a coastal surge, which then leads to flooding. It's a very different idea about what the risk is. And I'm not sure how helpful it is that the public has absorbed this, even if it's very far off, this very dramatic perception of the risk of sea level rise as Singapore under the waves. I think it probably helps the public to calibrate their support for the government response, which is to start investing in coastal defense infrastructure, if they can see it more as a flooding problem. And then you can look at the success of Singapore's government agencies in dealing with flooding in inland areas, how that's been approached, and how it's improved dramatically over time, despite severe and extreme weather storm events. And that can help people then to understand how the actions that have been taken by the government on coastal defense are an appropriate response to the nature of the risk. Okay, those are just some thoughts around sea level rise. Maybe I can leave Harvey to address other bits of the question, but happy to come back if there were more that I should say on other aspects of it.
Yeah, I think you've talked about the local impact, the impact on local citizens and their perceptions towards this very existential issue. But I also would like either of you to deal with this, the impact on our neighbors. Right? We do have to make choices, but also I think going back to this whole idea of leadership, right? As we have done with respect to water management and conservation, maybe exporting or leading the way in terms of helping this issue of sea level rise for our neighbors as well. And then, of course, there's the question being put about the impact of what we do with respect to civil defense for sea level rise on our neighbors. The use of a lot of sand from our neighbors. So if you could address some of that, that'd be great. Thank you. Harvey?
So I'll try to. This is very important questions which are tied with multiple actors and policies and politics. So I'll give you a example. We know that Singapore is a very ferocious importer of sand, for instance, for reclamation, and we have gone around our neighbors, depleting their coastlines, in our effort to get more sand for reclamation. Of course, you might say that, of course, this means that what we do have impacts on some places, which is correct. But I feel that there is a additional element in the sense that these distant places, right? Not all of the people would be objectionable to our actions. So it really depends on whether the kind of economic benefits that can be traced to selling of sand to our neighbor, to us from our neighbors, how is it trickled down to the local community, for instance? So I believe that the compensation, if there ever was, would be very lopsided, and that gives rise to a very persistent resentment to the point that that there would have been bans. And of course, local government would think differently from the central government as well. We have all these complicating political issues. At the end of the day, the buck still stops at us, of course. We make the decision. We are the one who start the process. So this is not a very easy question to answer, and I have no good answer for it. So I will just leave aside this sand for reclamation bit. I want to go back to this fear, this risk of climate change and urban flooding, for instance. And here I'm going to say a little interesting anecdote from one of our research sites in Jakarta. This, is part of what Christopher introduced earlier on our research on citizen urban science and citizen well-being. So we went to a neighborhood. It's not a really low class or delimited neighborhood. It was an average, perhaps lower middle income district. And one of the questions we asked would be, what are the kinds of threats or urban insecurities you feel? And list, and they choose. So basically, what happens is that flooding was like number 6 or 7, way down. But in that area, the Jakarta government actually raised that area as the highest risk for flooding. So it's a red zone. So it is a zone that needs a lot of intervention. So of course we have a lot of with the follow-up, we haven't done so yet. But we have a lot of hypotheses to suggest. Well, one of the simplest reasons is that they have much bigger problems, immediate, clear, and present danger to be worried about. And indeed, job security was one, and mobility, how they travel, was the second. Of course, we can say, well, flooding actually affects that, but that's another question altogether. So that could be one. The other question that we were thinking, the other answer that we think of this anomaly is that I feel that the residents might think that if they agree with the government's assessment of their district as a red zone, it might be forced to move or forced to be evicted or forced to endure the inconvenience of so-called flood improvement works. So there could be a whole lot of reasons. So my point is to illustrate that really there are so many different ways of looking at the same issues. And I think that's why I feel, especially for something as amorphous as environmental performance, it's not easy. It's very hard to wrap our heads around it because there's just too many missing elements or indeterminate elements.
Olivia, anything to add?
I'm happy to just chime in on the second part of your question about leadership. What's Singapore's role in the region in terms of finding solutions, for example, to sea level rise. And I think perhaps also applies to water management of water generally, is that both the biggest contribution, but also the hardest thing to translate is governance. Singapore is part of the reason why it's been able to achieve so much in its own water security. It's been it's kind of a very joined up, far-sighted, consistent efforts to deal with its water security challenge. And the fact that there is unified government with a clear policy goal and very clear performance indicators for the public agencies involved has been very helpful in achieving that. In addition, of course, to the technological advancement and financial aspects of just sheer investment in the infrastructure. But I think that's what is most of interest to other cities and states who come to Singapore to learn about its water policy. But at the same time, it's the most difficult thing for them to implement back home. And I think the same thing could be said for sea level rise too. I think there's no doubt that Singapore's engineers, its designers, its economists have an enormous amount to contribute to other cities, coastal cities in the region, in terms of how to plan for infrastructure, how to design it for multiple purposes. But can what makes that possible in Singapore, that kind of future-focused government and the link between the policy goal and the availability of financing, can that be replicated elsewhere? And so maybe the efforts on the part of Singapore and the contribution is in both these things, right? Is mobilizing its experts to help countries design solutions, but then to mobilize its policy experts on how to achieve the sort of governance aspect that supports all of this.
And maybe if I can challenge you a little bit further, possibly introducing other actors too. What about the private sector? What about other players that might be sort of co-opted, brought into this coalition that Harvey was talking about, to kind of act not just in Singapore, obviously, but to go into the rest of the region where these issues are clearly quite pressing, but they lack the resources, they lack the planning capacity, the funding capacity in that respect, and we're almost coming back to that idea of that leadership role, both kind of in the doing, but also in the kind of the enabling, not just for ourselves, but for the rest of the region. And I wonder if you want to kind of touch on that. What kind of role does then can Singapore evolve, rather than just that front and center, we're the best at everything kind of thing, to actually just be a facilitator, understanding the different contexts that might exist in the region.
That's for me to tackle again. Sure. Yes, in other aspects, Singapore, does act as a hub, and the vibrancy of the universities. I know we're at them, so we should be careful what we say about ourselves. But the activity at the universities, and I know that we and of course Harvey's group are very much engaged with regional counterparts and partnering with other universities, creating this conversation. And we have much to learn too from those who are living and experiencing the challenges that we're talking about. I think at the same time, in terms of sort of Singapore's leadership role in bringing in other partners, a key group of people are property developers. And in Singapore, that relationship works in one way. We were just talking about, or Harvey was talking about this example from Jakarta. And in the greater Jakarta area, property developers play a role in some ways as sort of surrogate public agencies. They're providing public services, which we often expect governments to provide, like sanitation or putting in transport within very large property developments. So engaging with them and both passing knowledge onto them and engaging with them as partners could be one way to sort of accelerate the adoption of climate solutions and of regional exchange as well. And I guess, of course, there will be Singapore development companies which are active in the region, ASEAN and beyond, who can provide a conduit for that as well.
Harvey, anything to add? Perhaps in your experience in Jakarta, in terms of engaging different stakeholders?
Well, I suppose I can only speak generally and from my own personal experience, which is that I think we may have an image problem amongst our neighbors. So it boils down to this. I think whether justified or not, the better ones would have a grudging respect for us, but most would just a little bit. I don't know how to phrase it in a correct way, but you know what I mean. So it is that sense of like what you say earlier, Christopher. We are best at everything. So there is my mind a grain of truth in that Singaporeans might portray ourselves as that kind of person, right? That kind of maybe not know it all, but we are offering you good advice kind of persona, which may not necessarily sit well with our neighbors. So that's what I sense. But the good news is that I feel it's fairly easy on a person-to-person basis to rebuild that kind of conversation to a conversation that is more authentic and meaningful and helpful, to both of us. Like Olivia said, we have much to learn, not least, if we are cynical, they represent sites of economic opportunities as well. That's the long and short of it for us, at least. But through our work in Cambodia, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines, there is this process of rebuilding. No, not rebuilding, but reorientating our conversation, how we see each other. I think it's necessary to do that. But like I said, it is not as difficult as it might seem. It's actually quite easy. We do need to have that kind of mentality and hold that kind of mentality in truth, not in cynicism, not because I need to be like that so that I can facilitate our works with these people. No, it doesn't work like that. You have to genuinely believe that we have to start somewhere and we have to start on an equal basis.
I like the optimism and the kind of the collaborative spirit that what we just said. Maybe if we can then now take some audience questions, and what I'll do is bundle up questions from Eunice O and Jonathan Tan and an anonymous questioner, and really focus on the idea of nature conservation. This, I think, the point that you touched on earlier, Harvey, about conservation and development. The balance between the two. And Jonathan asked in specific terms, whether nature conservation and development can be considered to be in harmony with each other, rather than having to kind of trade one off against the other. Is it possible? Can we do that? And then, kind of just that relationship between nature and the environment, and the kind of the pure raw economic benefits. So I think those are the two things that Eunice and Jonathan were asking or hinting at when they asked the question. Any thoughts about that? I mean, these are probably high-level questions, but what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that's a perennial question and a highly important one, especially in a place like Singapore. But it is also because we are talking about Singapore here that I feel the solution is actually, coming to us on its own. In other words, what is the balance? Whether there is or could be a balance between conservation and development. I think that the argument will resolve itself in the sense that the general population, at least in Singapore, would be gradually desensitized or have a very different kind of idea of what nature should be or what nature could be and what nature must do to themselves. I think I'm putting my head out there to forcing this. I think that the younger generation don't care much. Most of them don't, about physical aspect, the aesthetical aspect of it. If you talk about the action-based aspect of environmental behavior, I feel that, maybe, but the newer generation, I feel they have no qualms about involving themselves, immersing themselves in a very AI-created environment. And they like it. And we've seen research in other countries, in UK, for example, where people actually prefer that kind of experience because it is more immediate. You read the benefits in very clear, uncertain terms, although it's a very artificial term. But you see, this border between what is nature, what isn't nature, and what should you consider nature, and what are your demands of nature, I think that has changed within a generation and a half. So that's my roundabout answer to a very complicated question.
Olivia, any thoughts on this point?
Sure, I can share a couple of thoughts. Harvey's comments were very interesting and took the discussion in a direction that was really unexpected. So it's a little food for thought for me. But in the meantime, maybe a more a sort of middle of the road economics answer is that the trade-off between environmental quality and economic development depends what stage you're at in economic development as a country. And clearly there's a stage at which a country is based in manufacturing, especially focusing on low-cost manufacturing, and that tension between environmental quality and economic development is particularly acute. When you get to when the country is already high income, highly developed, and is moving towards a service economy, it's actually relatively easy for the economy to keep on growing while in fact reducing its impact on the environment and improving both local and broader environmental performance. And I think that's where that's certainly the level of development that Singapore finds itself at now. So that's That doesn't mean that the environmental problems have gone away. They've shifted to other countries which are now at that lower stage of development. But it does mean that from Singapore's point of view, it doesn't face that particularly difficult trade-off which other countries find themselves in now. There are a bunch of studies which have tried to look at the relationship between environmental regulation, environmental standards, and aspects of economic growth, and in particular, innovation. And there's quite some debate about whether tougher environmental regulation stimulates innovation or not. And there have been some big names engaging in this debate. If you look at it from the level of the economy as a whole, it's not very easy to make that argument. If you look at it at the level of a sector or a subsector, the introduction of regulation does stimulate innovation because it poses a constraint for firms, and firms look for a way around it. Which means that if we think, for example, about stricter regulation on air quality, on emissions of air pollutants, then it stimulates that can stimulate innovation in scrubbers for power plants, which don't constrain in the end, which don't constrain economic growth, which have a very limited impact on costs, and at the same time improve environmental quality. When it comes to carbon emissions and regulation related to climate change, we're talking about such a systemic change that transition is going to happen across all areas of the economy. And precisely because it is so widespread, I think we can be more confident of the innovation impact, the positive innovation impact of stricter regulation. And I don't think that will necessarily come at the cost of economic growth, net economic growth. Of course, there will be distributional consequences, and how to deal with those is going to be part of the big part of the policy challenge.
Thanks, Olivia. And maybe again sticking with this topic, but also pulling one of the questions that, or a couple of questions that have been asked by the audience. This idea that given the challenge of this climate crisis, the urgency, the question is whether we should be considering more radical solutions. So that actually even have an impact on detracting from economic growth. Right? And the example is divesting immediately from fossil fuels. Something like that. Is that going to be a spur for innovation? Just doing it means that we're forced to embrace new solutions that perhaps a more a relaxed approach to change will not foster.
I'm happy to launch in. I like this question a lot. Let's try something in the middle. The problem with very radical solutions, while they might seem an appropriate response to the climate emergency, is that they create very high transaction costs. So everybody jumps to deal with this. The technologies don't have time to develop. They're higher cost than they would be. We don't have examples that we can then replicate or scale up. So having a longer transition horizon will lower costs. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't start taking action. And I think that's what so much of the commentary, the analysis around climate action emphasizes, brings to the fore, is that we don't have to do everything today, but we do have to start now. And what should we do? Well, a great way to find out what we should do is to impose a carbon tax. And I don't know whether there are any specific questions on this and whether we'll come to it later. But a carbon tax is an information revelation mechanism. We don't know how much it's going to cost to reduce emissions until we regulate and we start trying. And there are many examples from other environmental regulation efforts. A really striking example is regulation around acid rain. So in the US, air quality regulations were introduced to tackle sulfur dioxide, SOx and NOx, sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide. The estimates of how much that was going to cost to firms to reduce their emissions turned out to be 3 or 4 times what it actually cost firms to do so. So by introducing a policy like a carbon tax, we can start to reveal that information. We're not going to know how much it costs to take a climate action until we start to try. And Singapore could be at the forefront of that by very much under discussion at the moment, how much the carbon tax should be, whether to, when and how much to raise it. But that's one step that can be taken very soon and will trigger action, which will help to reveal those costs. And I don't think it's overly optimistic to expect that the impact on economic growth of keeping emissions below 2 degrees C over an 80-year time horizon will not be negative. We'll wait with a lot of interest to see the IPCC's report about Working Group 3, which is looking at sort of mitigation options, and will include estimates of the impact on global economic growth of the solutions that are currently available. That should come out, I think, in the middle of the year.
Okay, we have another question that I think follows on quite nicely from our discussion here about things like carbon taxes, and it relates to standards, green sustainability standards in the region. It's come from Jeffrey Tan and Arnold Teo. Question, about again, Singapore's leadership role in terms of the sustainability efforts, the setting of those standards. The carbon tax is an example of that. Right? You talked about the kind of the signaling effect that a carbon tax might have, the revelation of the cost onto the environment. So how might we start our green sustainability standards, or form them, set them, and do that in a way that is sensitive, not just to our own context, but to that in the region? I think, Harvey, you talked about that earlier. How do we, kind of consider all of that?
I feel, idea of a coalition is good, but in general, the driving logic behind a coalition is that you need a vehicle that is seen to be not vested, right? Has high legitimacy and high respectability. So a coalition generally will give that impression, but it could be through some kind of organization, I don't know, ASEAN or some kind of supranational organization that drives this effort. I think that might help also. So that could, of course, involve a coalition kind of idea in it, but it may not. So there are various ways to do it. But I think the key challenge here is to, first, how do you persuade, neighbors or whoever that this was developed in the most objective, fairest manner that we can think of. Yeah, and second, to really, in relation to that first issue, is that we have to be seen as completely impartial, to the whole process. I think that is fundamental to gaining legitimacy on any kinds of policies or framework that we develop, and we hope other will take on, because we are not, I don't know, China, USA, some other countries, they have other kind of arsenal behind them, but we have nothing except objectivity, truth, and sincerity is what I think it is.
Olivia, any additional points?
I think the easiest area for Singapore to show leadership is amongst cities. And I know that means that we're not fully taking into account Singapore's status as a city-state, but it does provide a natural group of comparators, including some very high-performing comparators for Singapore. And I know that Singapore is already very much engaged in sort of cities networks, global cities networks. But amongst there, it's not simply that Singapore is the leader and is trying to impress its learnings on others, but also extensive opportunities to learn from what other cities are doing. And in some policy areas, other cities have done things which were which are very innovative and exceed what Singapore has so far managed to achieve. And I think that provides a useful and a rather sort of cooperative, collaborative context for Singapore to engage on the development of indicators.
Thanks. Okay, so maybe let's try and make a stab, given that we're coming to the end of the session, stab at a few more questions from the audience. I have one, it's a combined question. I've combined it with two questions, one from Gillian Koh and another from Nicole Lam. And really talking about the Green Plan. So Singapore's Green Plan 2030. And the question is what, is it ambitious enough? What excites you most about it? So the EV aspect of it, I don't think so, right? It can't be that. Harvey, you want to make a stab first?
Yeah, I think one of the most I find how should I say interesting, encouraging, yet I feel may not probably succeed. This push to grow our own local agriculture, I think it's a neat idea, and I like it. But I never thought that we could even. I know it's an ambition, it's something to look forward to, but the target is way beyond possibility. Is what I think. So I think you want to be aspirational, but not in a sense that you cannot even achieve it. Again, I'm putting my head up. Maybe I could be proven wrong, and I hope to be proven wrong. But that kind of targets in a green plan, I think it's not aspirational. It becomes fictional and almost fantastical, and it's not realistic. I feel so. There must be some kind of adjustment to that regard. I was expecting more on having some kind of concrete policies and ideas with regards to protecting our wildlife, to mitigate the increasing encounters of human and wildlife interactions. I think that's something that I thought would be increased phenomena. I don't think it says much about that. So that's something that I was a bit expecting something, but it did not.
So something that wasn't there, but you would have hoped should have been in there. But,
right.
Olivia, what excites you most in the Green Plan, if anything?
So it's an interesting combination of that aspirational target that Harvey just spoke about, and then some targets which have been which are already very familiar and have been achieved or almost already been achieved.
Mm-hmm.
And I think on the water side, it would have been exciting to see things going further. Although those targets in sort of international comparative terms are already, very, very impressive. Yeah, possibly, and certainly what the sort of climate activist community would have looked for would have been in a more ambitious target on emissions, or specifically a target for net zero. And in the last 12 or 18 months, many countries have been coming out with ambitious targets for the achievement of net zero. There are lots of issues around net zero as a concept. There are lots of issues around whether the countries that have committed to this are not just pulling an aim out of thin air, which they hope nobody's ever going to check whether they achieved. Singapore has a reputation for setting realistic targets and going on to achieve them. And I think perhaps the reason why Singapore hasn't set a target for net zero is because it doesn't want to do so until there's a clear idea of how it gets there. What would be great to see would be a bunch of attendant policies which would help us to see how Singapore is going to get there. And a bit more of that in the Green Plan alongside the excellent efforts in other areas, I think would have helped to provide the public and businesses with that sort of vision. Like what's the roadmap to get there, even if we're not sure exactly when Singapore is going to get there.
And related, I mean, do you think there's a bigger role for incentives? We don't have very much by way of those. For example, the 30 by 30 goal is, again, as you say, Harvey, quite aspirational. You even said fantastical. But might it be assisted? It's a stretch target, but might it be helped if we have a bit more incentives to kind of just drive that response along?
Yeah, of course, it helps a lot, and it also helps immensely if there is that the actors involved in this endeavor, right? Let's say the farmers, they are convinced of a relatively sense of stability moving forward. I think that is something that is a big disincentive, right? So they are not sure whether it could be viable to farm or to fish in 10 years' time. It's not good enough to have a land lease that is constantly renewed and shorter and shorter leases. I think that's a disincentive because nobody wants to work with that kind of uncertainty. And indeed, we have seen farmlands being moved, not taken away, but alternative sites were offered. Of course, we can say since alternative sites are offered, it's not a big deal, but it's the disruption to business, and businessmen don't think of this as mere, inconvenience of moving. It is an uncertainty. So do you want to provide an environment of stability that really convinces people that you truly want this and you are committed to providing the resources available necessary for people to actualize this vision, this aspiration?
Thanks, Harvey. Any thoughts from you, Olivia, at this point? Okay, great. Let's, again, we're coming to the end. So maybe I'll deal with one more question from the audience and ask about this idea of domestic recycling rates in Singapore, right? Is there something that we can do to boost that? Olivia, you talked about, kind of moving to this zero or lower waste or that cyclical circular economy model. What do you think? I mean, is it possible for something to be introduced, like as what was said in this question, a compulsory waste classification system, just to kind of encourage people, send those signals?
It's so hard, and I've had a bunch of discussions with NEA, talk about the efforts that they've made and the range of sort of policies, nudges, and things a little stronger than nudges, which have been considered. I know this is a really big challenge in Singapore, and I'm not sure. One thing that would help for a start is to teach people how to recycle. And again, I know this is something that NEA has been doing, but so much of what goes into the recycling bin doesn't get recycled because it hasn't been properly prepared or sorted. And that then feeds into the impression that people have that stuff that goes in the recycle bin doesn't get recycled. So if that's going to happen, why should I do it? And it creates a very unhelpful spiral of expectations about what happens to things in the blue bin. if you've spent a bit of time sort of recently in sort of European countries, diligently kind of separating their waste, and you think, well, how do you do that? How do you change that mindset? Even when people have to go quite far out of their way to put their recycles in a specific bin, and they're going to do it, and that there must be some level, a threshold at which the expectation about how others behave and how others expect me to behave then trigger a positive cycle in terms of recycling. How Singapore can increase the recycling rate to trigger that, I'm not 100% sure, and I know that lots of different things have been tried. And right now the policy is to give out recycling bins to each household. I wonder if putting recycling in the public domain, getting people to take their rubbish to a place where they then have to sort it and put things in the bin in front of other people, helps to create that expectation about the sort of social expectation about recycling, but comes with lots of other costs too. And people are very motivated by convenience. So I can't guarantee that would work either.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. Unfortunately, we only have got a few minutes left. And as we draw this session to a close, I'm actually going to paraphrase a question that's come in from Edwin Chua and ask Olivia and Harvey to leave us with their thoughts on this question. What is the one critical action that our future selves in 2030 will thank us for doing now in 2022 in building out this city as a resilient, thriving, and sustainable green space? Olivia, would you like to have a go first?
So it's a question about what we should do. And I spoke in my remarks at the beginning about these sort of three different types of environmental actions that individuals can take. My feeling is that it's the third type. It's those public sphere actions that are going to be the most important. And so if I have to pick one thing, it would be supporting a carbon tax.
Fantastic. Carbon tax. Coming up soon, I think. Harvey, your action point?
Well, I think I will pick a behavior or action that my future self will say that there's no excuse you shouldn't have done it or you should not have done it. So I'll pick something that is easy and everyone can do, which is to reduce their meat intake. So perhaps just reduce meat intake 10-15%. So a day or two a week, you just abstain from meat. I think that's good enough. And you don't depend on the government, infrastructure, education level, none of this thing that involves in your personal decision to reduce meat intake. I think that's what I would do.
So very good. We've got a suggestion at the very public level, high level carbon tax, and then one at the personal level, an appeal by Harvey to reduce our individual meat consumption. So thank you both. And we've got these two very fascinating, somewhat sort of challenging, I guess, in some cases, action points from our speakers. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions, but rest assured, they are very much appreciated. IPS will note them and see if we can address the matters raised in future work and discussions. I'd like to thank Olivia and Harvey for spending the time and their insights with us on the subject of city as a green space, and to thank all of you too for your contribution to today's discussion, as well as in advance if anyone wishes to take up our speakers' actionable ideas to build up this city as a green space. The next final virtual forum begins shortly at 4 p.m. And is entitled Cities in the Digital Space. It's moderated by IPS Senior Research Fellow Dr. Carol Soon and features Mr. Liu Chun Hong, CEO of IMDA, and Professor Carlo Ratti of MIT. See you then.